Hi everyone, this is Pierrick from P2DESIGN. In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this stylized explosion in Blender. Good news for the default cube, we will keep it, but we will get rid of the point lamp, select the camera and press Ctrl-Alt-0 in front view to align it with the view. Let's set a pretty high focal length of 90 to avoid distortions, and set the resolution to 1080x1080. Then I will make sure that its location on the X and Z axis are set to 0 so that it's aligned with the center of our document. I will increase the cube resolution by adding a subsurf modifier with a level of 3 and apply it. I will then add a new subdivision modifier set to 1 only, and then a displacement modifier, and I will name this first cube explosion. This will be our initial explosion. We will create distortion on the surface by creating a texture to drive the displacement. Let's call it explosion and go into the texture tab with the displacement selected and create a Voronoi texture. Now I will set the shading to smooth on my model in the tool panel and then change the size and play with it. I think I used a value of 0.3 or 0.4. We will play with those values later on, so it's not super important, just try to match the result you want. If I now move or scale my model, nothing will happen, and I'd like to animate the displacement. So I need to set texture coordinate, and I will use an object, an empty currently, to drive the texture coordinates. Let's give the empty a name. Let's get back to our first object, and then on the displacement option in texture coordinate, I will set object and select the explosion controller. Now if I scale or move the controller, it will move and scale the texture, and if we move the object, as it will move onto a texture, and let's say a global world texture based on the position of another object, that will affect its appearance. So to deal with animation, I will open the dope sheet and also the timeline and set the start and end from 0 to 40. That's gonna be enough. I'm using a frame rate of 24 FPS. Now I can set a first scaling keyframe on the frame 4 because I want this first blast to be animated on 4 frames. And on frame 0 I will scale it to 0, press I and add a second keyframe. Then on frame 5 I want it to disappear, so I will scale it at 0, press I and insert a scaling keyframe. I will then set the interpolation by pressing T to linear because I don't want an acceleration, and on 4 frame that wouldn't be easy to figure out or to see. And now I will play with the scale of my empty that will move the texture onto our model, change the mid-level and increase the strength to have more distortion, something more exploding, let's say more distorted. I will finally replace my second keyframe to something more extreme to get a better result. Don't forget to save your file oftenly. Now let's add a new cube, apply a subdivision modifier to it and then add a second subdivision modifier, then stack a displacement modifier, name this smoke and create a new displacement texture. Let's first use a cloud texture. Let's set the shading to smooth as we did before, and what we will do is that we will be using a 2 displacement modifier to achieve this. The first cloud displacement will be used to create the main shape, and on top of this we will create smaller distortions to mimic the small cloud turbulences. To have better control upon the cloud texture, I will be using in colors the ramp. This will open a color ramp that will allow us to play with the contrast and modify the displacement on the fly. Once I have tweaked the strength and I'm happy with the result, I will add a new subdivision modifier that I will put at last, and then another displacement modifier that I will put after, so that the model, once displaced by the cloud displacement, will be subdivided and then redisplaced. This is how we get nice resolution and nice distortions onto our model. For the second displacement modifier, I will create a new texture and use a Voronoi texture. This will allow us to have nice blobby effect upon the surface of our smoke cloud. Beware, when editing your texture, you have to first select the correct displacement stack and then play with the texture, or it will update your modifier and you will have an unexpected result as this one. Once I recovered from this mistake, I was able to play a bit with the levels and the strength, so just study the blend file if you want more information. I won't say use this value or this value, just play a bit with it. And to get the animation while I'm moving or scaling the object, I will add an empty that will allow us to control the texture space of the displacement modifier. Then come the time where I will be playing with the values again and the position and see if the movement pleased me or not. So playing with the size of the texture, the size of the controller, and then I can set my keyframe. So I go into camera view and set the maximum size of the object first to frame 35. So I will press I and scaling, then go to frame number 4, which is the end of our first explosion, and set it to 0 and insert a keyframe. As this object will be used both to simulate the fire and the smoke, I want it to get pretty big pretty fast, so I will set an intermediate scaling keyframe on frame 7 or 8 by scaling it a bit bigger than the first blast. I will then refine the deformation by playing with our texture controller, the empty we have created before. And then I will go into the graph editor so that I will be able to work on the speed of the scaling with more ease. I will set the first keys to vector so that there isn't any acceleration. It will be blowing very fast. There won't be this ease in. And I will also slightly offset the different curves for the Z, X and Y scaling axis so that I get a bit of distortion on the initial animation. So try to figure out how to play with those curves, and then this is where you will have to put the more work to get a nice animation. Making nice animation will sure help you making nice special effects. Seeing our animation in real time is pretty hard, so I will go into the output of my render and create a folder playblast where I'll be able to export short movies of what I'm doing using the OpenGL render. So in the output option, I will set it to mpeg video, and in the encoding I will be using the H264 and set it to lossless. Then to have a better visual feedback, in the shading option I will use a matte cap and select one with those crispy outer edge, and then I can click this icon to launch the playblast render, the OpenGL render. This outputs me a movie file where I can see the animation in real time. So from this point I wanted to make the animation a little longer, so I've upgraded the timeline to 50 frames, and then I've played with the curve to have more motion in the final steps. So I've increased the size and slightly offset the last keyframes. Once happy with the timing, I can duplicate this first cloud to have a second one and slightly rotate it and offset its position. As I duplicate it, it will keep the animation of the previous cloud, and now I just have to move back my camera to be able to frame the whole cloud and launch another play blast. We can now dive into shading. The first shader will be very easy to be done, so I will open the node editor and select my explosion. The cool thing about this shading is that we'll be using only emission shader, so it will be very easy to have a real-time feedback. So I will add a shader, emission shader, and I will plug in a converter color ramp and before an input layer weight, and we'll be using some kind of the Fresnel effect to drive 4 colors. So I will be using some fire tones with a bright yellow, a yellow orange and red, and to get some cartoony shading I will switch from linear to constant, so that there is no transition between the colors and it seems like it has been hand painted, and will give some kind of vector style or hand painted style to our shading. So it's the easiest shader ever created. While I am creating those shaders, I'm using the filmic color management. That's why I need to push the strength of my emission shaders to get bright color, which is fine. If you tend to do the post-production directly into this scene, that's fine. We'll do the post-production in another blend file using PNG export. So maybe we'll switch of color managing later on. So now I will just work onto the shading of the cloud. So it will be pretty exactly the same process. I will use a layer weight to drive fire tones color with constant interpolation, and then I will create a second shader that will be our smoke into the same node. The brighter tone should be on the outside, because if you think of this cloud of fire, the most density will be on the edge, because this is where your eye will be facing the more flame particles, let's say. But when we are creating the smoke, as it's not emitting light but theoretically absorbing it, the outside edge must be the darkest one. So I will use gray tones and end up with an outline that is close to a pure black color. I will then mix those two shaders using a shader mix shader, and I will plug in the facing into a matte node with the greater than property, meaning that any color that has a value over a given one will serve as a mask, and so we will have a sharp mask that will evolve following the Fresnel effect we have been using to create those color. And if we animate this value, this will allow us to rapidly create a transition from fire to smoke. As soon as my nodes are ordered, I can keyframe the 0 value just after the explosion, and then keyframe a 1 value, which will be the transition from fire to complete smoke. And then I can play with the animation curve of this value to enhance a bit the transition. So if you're not comfortable with this, just use a linear interpolation or keep it as it is in Bezier and just offset a bit the keyframe in the dope sheet instead of using the graph editor. But I truly encourage you to train with the graph editor to get used to it, because it's very important when you want to make animation. And this is what we are doing here. We are animating properties, but that's part of animation too. Once done with this, I've launched a first render. It's very fast as we are using emission shader, so don't hesitate to launch a lot of different render to check out your timing. Now the second thing we want is our smoke to fade out, and to do so we'll use the same tip using the greater than math node to mix in a transparent shader. And when we will animate this second greater than node, this will allow us to get more and more transparency. The main issue with this method is that as our material gets transparent, we will be able to see the clipping between our two smoke cloud, which kind of remove part of the realism, let's say, or the style we want, and it instantly looks computer made, which is not very nice. But I found out two methods to get rid of this. The first one will be to separate those two clouds in the render layers, and the second one was to use a Boolean operation of union between those two clouds, which for me is the most obvious method. But the problem I met is that during the rendering, some frames were not updating correctly, and so the cloud was disappearing, or instead of a union I am some frame with a difference while I had consistency in my normals. So I don't understand how to deal with this because I'm not really used to use the Boolean tool. To get rid of some of this effect, we can use an input geometry back facing to mixing a transparent BSDF. This will remove some of the inside faces that are shaded. And the second thing I have done is that I've been using a plane to cut the cloud in half using render layers. Inside View, add a new plane and rotate it so that it's facing the camera, and then scale it so that it's bigger than our cloud. And then I will move it onto another layer. I will then name it as mask. Then I will move it backward to make sure that it's not clipping front faces of our cloud, the one we want to see in our render. Then I will go into the render layers, call the first one explosion, and then create a second one that we will call smoke. And this is where we will be rendering our cloud. So the first one is the first layer to be rendered, and the second one is our smoke layer. I then need to set a mask layer where is our plane, but I've forgotten to display it for the time being, so we won't see the result. But please trust me, this will make sense when we will launch the render. So now I want to work on some outer waves on the explosion. So I've made it as I did the other one, adding a cube, subdividing it, applying the subdivision modifier, add a new one, add a displacement modifier, and play with new textures and eventually another object to get something less complex, something that will pop very fast around our initial explosion. So this is where it turned a bit experimental, because I was mixing noise into vectors and stuff like this to get noisy edges. So what I end up with is use our initial shader of the explosion and then add a noise texture, increasing the detail and inputting it into a color ramp set to constant. I have then added some vector curve in vector input vector curve and use our facing value as an input. Then I slightly make an S on every curves. So this is not something you figure by thinking about what you are doing, but mostly by experimenting. Then I will add a noise texture and plug it into the scale, and then I will still play with those curves until I get an outer edging with this noise that I like. exactly this one. I can then use it to mix in a new transparent shader. The idea here is to only have the outer edges to be seen. And so then I've been playing a bit with my color ramp, and I think I figured later on that keeping a constant interpolation was better. Then I've played with the greater than value animation to make it fade, and I've finally subtracted another noise texture to cut out a bit the edge and input some irregularity to it. Let's now add sparkles and debris to our explosion, so it will be very easy. We will add an icosphere that will be our emitter, as we will be using particles, and I will scale it so that it's quite as big as the very first blast, as this is when the emission will start. I apply rotation and scale and then go to the particles and create a new one. I will call these sparkles. Also name the settings sparkles. This will be an emitter and it will start at frame 4 and end at frame 5. I just want one frame of emission. The lifetime of the sparkle will be shorter than the animation. Let's try 30 with a random lifetime for those particles. The time they will be displayed half, meaning that some of the sparkles will only leave half. I'm just checking how it moves by launching the animation. So I will increase the normal speed, which is the first blast, and then I will input a randomness to this speed, 5 to 5, so that there is an initial velocity of 5 and a random variation from +0 to +5 added to it. As these are pretty light objects, I also want them to slow down after the explosion, meaning that they will be dragged by the air around them. So I will play with the damp value until it reaches a physical and an animation aspect I like, and then I will also play with the Brownian option, increasing it to 50, so that there is a jittering effect into the movement and they go all over the place, like there is turbulences into the air due to the heat of the explosion. I've also reduced a bit the gravity and reduced the number to 100. I think the gravity, like I've cut it to half. Then I've created a second particle system, also emitter, called stone. So this time only 50, start at 4 and at 5. The stone won't disappear, they will get out of our camera range, so 50 for the lifetime is okay. And I will let the gravity to 1. Then on the next layer I will create some objects that will replace the particles so that there is something to be rendered. To create the little stone I will add a new icosphere and add a decimate modifier to it, and I will reduce the decimation amount so that it loses a resolution a bit randomly, and I will then duplicate it, reduce again the amount and do a third copy. Then I will apply the modifier on every object and I will name them properly and group them by pressing Ctrl G, go into the object option and give a name to the group. I will then add a pretty low poly icosphere that will be our sparkle object, and I will add it a new shader that will be the sparkle particle shader. I can now edit back my particle system, and for the sparkle into the render load the object sparkle, and for the stone load the group stones, and don't forget to click into render uncheck emitter so that we won't be rendering the icosphere. Then under render I will set the size for both the sparkle and the stone, and set also a random size for each of them so that we have nice variation. So here just input the value that looks right to you. There is no specific value. I can then revise a bit my velocity, the size of the different elements until I have a visual feedback I like. Then I will select the sparkle object that will allow me to edit its material. So we will be using again an emission shader, and as an input we'll be using the color ramp and also the particle information. This will allow us to create a fading effect between the emission and a transparent shader, dividing the age and the lifetime. Once I figured the right way, I can invert my color ramp, set some fire tones, and use them to drive the color of the emission. I will add a second color ramp that will drive the strength of the emission by being multiplied by 10 or 20, and then I will add a last color ramp that will allow me to mix a transparent shader with our emission shader, so that when the particles are dying, they are fading and they get totally transparent once they reach the end of their life. Then to shade the stone, we could think we'll be using a diffuse shader also, but I will also use an emission shader to make rendering time super fast, and I will input a vector normals driven by an input geometry normal. And this will allow us, through a color ramp using the dot output, to give a color based on the orientation of these normals, which is very handy to fake lightning. Then I can set color on my color ramp and set them to constant. Then in the render layers, I will create one render layer per item. I will then make sure that the explosion is masked by the smoke is masked by the plane, etc. And in this version there is only one smoke layer. This is because I was using the boolean to get rid of the inside lines and the transparency problem we've been talking about at the very beginning, but later on I have separated the two smoke clouds on two different layers, making sure that one masks the other by clicking the mask layer option. Then I just render the combined pass. To save my render passes, I will go into the node editor, switch to render layer and enable use nodes. Then I will add an output file output that will allow me to add several slots for each render layer. So I will give a path to save my PNGs, and then I will duplicate the input render layer and select each of the layers and input them into the file output, giving a name for each file I want to save. I will make sure that I'm using RGB plus alpha and use PNG in 16-bit. Once I've launched a test render on one frame, I can launch the animation render. For the rendering option, I haven't shown them, I've forgotten to record them I believe, but I just use two samples, because as we are rendering emission shader, there is no bounces involved. The compositing will be pretty easy and pretty repetitive. I've just started a new Blender and get rid of the cube and the light, etc. Open the node editor, switch to render layers, use nodes, and then I've loaded the different image sequences I have rendered previously. Then to combine them, I will use a mix color alpha over and plug them in sequence. So you can see, or you will see, some bugs on my render compared to the very last one. This is because in the meantime I've reworked some of the mask on the renderer file. So don't worry, the file delivered is okay, and this is a lot of back and forth. I mean, I've been testing it like maybe 5 or maybe 10 times before I get to the result. You are seeing reworking the explosion timing, reworking the masking, and re-rendering it each time. But as each frame took like 3 to 4 seconds, that was okay. That was the time for me to add some rest from the computer for 1 or 2 minutes. Basically, first step is to add some glowing effect. So I will add a filter blur. I will switch it to fast Gaussian and plug in the very first explosion file. I will set it to relative so that I can enter a value in percent of the screen, and then I will add this blurry result to the original one with a color mix color. Since I had some dual color due to the color management, which was set to filmic, I will switch back to the default color to have burnt color. This is not something you will do for realistic result, but for this stylized result I want something easy to contrast. In the very end I will add another alpha over node with a gray color, a grayish color, to have a background to see the glowing effect I'm inputting. One thing not to forget whenever you are mixing color is to click on this little icon that will add the alpha of the first socket into the second one. I will repeat the exact same process for the second explosion set, and then for our fire cloud I want also to add this glowing, but only on the brightest color. To do so I will add an input matte color keying that will allow me to isolate or mask my object or my item based on a color, which is very handy when you are using solid colors like that. So once I have this set, I just have to pick the color directly onto my picture. I will add 2 of them in sequence so that I can isolate both the reddish and the orangey color and only have the outer color keyed. Then I will play a bit with the different threshold to make sure that I got rid of the unwanted colors, and then I will add again a glowing effect using a filter blur set to relative, etc. I will finally add in line a last blur effect, but this time I will set an animation on the size value so that I can make the cloud fading just on the very end, and we keep it pretty sharp at the beginning. I will then proceed exactly the same way for the particles by color keying the stones and then blurring only the sparkles with and adding them on top of each other with a mixed color so that I have this glowing effect on those fiery elements. Then to enhance the readability of all of it, instead of having a solid background, I've decided to create a gradient, but the problem is that there is no tool to create gradients rapidly in Blender. So what you need to do is input a new texture, and then you need to go into the texture options and create a new texture. I will select blend, and then I will use the color ramp to give it the color I want, and I will replace the background using this. Then to make everything more dynamical, it's important to add a flashing effect. So I will be using an ellipse mask that I will make as big as my canvas, and then I will blur it a lot and use it to drive a color ramp. I will set very bright color into the color ramp and I will add them onto the final result, and I will key the mixing value so that it appears at 100% when the explosion appears, and then fade on 3 or 4 frames. Before I launch the render, I've set the output to MPEG video and use the H264 encoder with perceptually lossless quality, and then click animation. So as I told you before, I was a bit disappointed about the blending between those two smoke clouds, and this was because of the problem of transparency. So this time I've decided to separate them on 2 layers and use one to mask each other. And I have then re-rendered the whole scene and just added in my composition file another node setup just to load this newly created smoke cloud. And I finally added a few stripes that appear on only 1 frame each at the very beginning, just to add this anime style onto the explosion, and that was the final touch to this. The very last thing I have done was to organize my post-production so that you can follow this tutorial more easily by checking out the files. Alright guys, hope you've enjoyed this short tutorial. My eyes are still bleeding from watching this explosion again and again. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and switch on the bell, and please support me going on my Gumroad page, downloading this course or even paying for it, and don't forget to check out my other freebies and my other courses. See you next time.